Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. I'm your host, Andy Meadows. Throughout my radio career as an on-air talent, then a programmer, and now as a consultant, one of the things I've dealt with firsthand on multiple occasions, and to be honest, something I've always been a little torn on since I'm a musician as well, is whether a radio station should pull an artist's music because of a scandal. As a musician, obviously, I want people to separate the art from the artist. After all, is a song any better or worse because of the character of the person singing it? But as a programmer and now as a consultant responsible for advising people on how to build and protect their station's brands, I know it's not that simple. The truth is, it's very hard to do that, to separate the art from the artist, especially with music, where the performer and their brand is so tied to particular songs. Once we know who an artist is, how much we like them affects how we hear their music. It literally affects how it hits our ear. That's the reason labels and artists are so protective of the artist's brands, and rightfully so. And unfortunately, accusations ring louder than corrections. So public opinion can change very quickly, and it takes a lot of time, work, and money to change it back. That's why the people involved in these scandals are often advised to get ahead of these things and act quickly, which most of them do. Also, it's human nature for us to want to take the rich and famous down a peg, people that seemingly have everything that we want. It's normal to want to take them down a notch. But radio stations as a platform that's, by the way, still more important than many outside our industry realize, shouldn't be reactionary and shouldn't treat every scandal the exact same. Each of these situations is different. There's a lot of nuance to these individual situations, and nuance matters. Making the wrong call either way could damage a station's brand, and that's also very hard to repair. None of these decisions should be taken lightly. They don't just affect the stars themselves, but lots of other people in their orbit as well. So programmers should talk to owners, managers, lawyers, if they can afford to, and their listeners before making the call one way or another on any of these kind of situations. And a quick caveat that should go without saying, but no programmer should ever pull an artist's songs because of a personal slight or a personal issue with that artist. That's a totally separate thing. But I've seen it happen, and there's no gray area there. That should never happen, because programming music on the radio should never be about personal taste or personal interest, at least if we want to do this for a long time. So let's go through a handful of these scandal situations, starting with the most recent one, and I'll give you my take, and I'd love for you to weigh in with yours as well by emailing me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com, forgot my own email, or editor@radioupdate.com, or commenting anywhere where this is posted. Garth Brooks. Last week, Garth Brooks was accused of sexually assaulting and raping the woman who worked for 19 years as his wife's makeup artist and also worked directly for Garth a few times. At the time of this recording, these are just allegations. Garth vehemently denies them and has accused the woman of extorting him for money. It should also be noted that as of right now, Garth hasn't been charged with any crime. There will be calls this week from listeners and probably non-listeners for country stations to take a stand on this. So the question is, should country radio stations pull Garth Brooks' music completely right now? It depends on a couple factors, would be my answer. A, is he one of the radio station's core artists? Most classic country stations now focus mainly on 1989 through 1996, Garth's heyday. So any of those stations, a guy that sold 170 million records is absolutely a core artist and a big part of their playlist. I wouldn't drop Garth on a classic country station unless or until more info comes out that makes it clear he did it, more women come out that sound credible, or he's convicted of a crime. Then you've got to drop him, especially if it's a bad crime. B, if you're a new country station that just touches on recurrent gold records from Garth, you probably are only playing a few songs from him anyway, so it's not a big deal to rest those for a few weeks while this gets sorted out. However, I would not make a big statement about it, or any statement. If you decide to remove his songs, which you certainly don't have to yet at this point, I would just quietly rest the songs and not say anything about it. Because if you do make a big statement and it turns out he's found innocent, that could also damage the station's brand. I don't know how powerful Garth Brooks still is in country, but at one point he was powerful enough to get a label head fired. That's a rumor, by the way. I don't know that for certain, but that's the rumor that goes around Nashville. And we all know relationships matter, especially in country. C, what does your audience think? Normally I say to let the audience decide by doing a poll. If that gets a big enough sample base in comparison to the station's cume, because everything's relative, let that make the decision for you. But the challenge of doing that on the front end of the news cycle is it will overwhelmingly come back that you should drop him, and you'll have to at that point. It will also likely get some buzz, which will help the station's brand in the short term. But if it turns out to be false, you could have egg on your face. Plus, Garth has already lost some of his fan base in country because he's so outspoken about his support for the LGBTQ community, and that runs counter to conservative Christians' religious beliefs, and they still make up a very large percentage of the country audience, especially in red states. So even before this, a should we play Garth Brooks still poll would probably return negative results. But it's doubtful many people were changing the station when Papa Love Mama came on. If he's convicted of rape, and that's if, obviously, many of them will change the station when that song comes on. P Diddy. P Diddy, however, has been charged with a crime. The number of his accusers are increasing, the legal process is in motion, but he hasn't been convicted yet, of course, although it seems highly likely that he will be on at least some, if not all of the charges. And P Diddy opens up another question on the music side. What do you do with collaborations? Most of P Diddy's hit songs were with other artists, sometimes several other artists. Do you pull all of them or just the signature ones or the ones where he has more than just a verse? If other music stars that are in his orbit get pulled into this as well, this scandal I mean, does their music also get dropped? My advice on Diddy would be to rest his signature tunes for now with the option to bring some of it back later if the situation changes. But the public outcry to drop anything with his voice on it may get so loud that you end up having to rest or drop it all. Michael Jackson. If you watch the documentary on HBO, it's hard to hear his music the same way, kind of like I was talking before. Once your opinion changes on a person, it affects how you hear their music. But that's a documentary, not a court of law. Documentary makers often take some creative license to leave out key details that don't fit the narrative and focus on the ones that do. Not saying he didn't do it. He very well might have. While he was never convicted of any of the real heinous stuff, he settled multiple times for millions of dollars out of court, and that's all public record. Maybe that was to make it go away and get it out of the news cycle. Maybe it's because he did it. I don't know, and neither do the majority of listeners of classic hit stations where Michael Jackson's music is still a mainstay. I would still play him unless your audience en masse tells you not to. R. Kelly. R. Kelly, on the other hand, was convicted of a crime. So unless an audience poll showed overwhelming support for continuing to play his music, I wouldn't. Especially since there's only a couple recurrent and gold categories of R&B stations that his tunes would be in anyway. So again, risk-reward. You're not playing a lot of his songs, so what's the harm in not playing a couple of those tunes? Milli Vanilli, a pop duo that famously lip-synced to the vocals of other singers. We all remember this, at least if we're old enough to. Milli Vanilli's deception was orchestrated by German record producer Frank Farian, who found New York-born and German-raised Robert Pilatus, I'm going to mispronounce these because I'm Texan, I'm sorry, Rob Pilatus, and Guadeloupe native Fab Morvan, living in a housing project in Munich. Poor to the point they were allegedly stealing food to survive, and the record producer offered each of the dancers $4,000 to become the faces of Milli Vanilli. This is something he'd done, by the way, this producer had done, by the way, back in the 70s with another band, and he fully got away with that one. He kept that secret for 25 years, and that was one where he personally sang on it. But had Frank Farian realized just how popular the Milli Vanilli duo would become, it might have occurred to him that their thick accents would raise questions. Pilatus' mother tongue was German and Morven's was French. They blew up very quickly, as we all remember, and even won a Grammy and an AMA in 1990. But living with that lie was getting to Rob and Fab. So they demanded that Farian let them sing on their next album or they would quit. They gave him an ultimatum, and he knew they were serious. So to get ahead of it, Farian put out a statement. The guys countered with a press conference, and it all came crashing down, and the fallout was massive. Arista, the record label, dropped them and deleted their entire catalog. Radio stations dropped them. Fans demanded refunds. They were burning their CDs and threatened to sue for fraud. And for the first time and the only time, their Grammy was revoked. That fall from fame was hard for Rob and Fab. In April of 1998, Rob Pilatus was found dead at 33 in Frankfurt of a suspected overdose. This just underscores how impactful these decisions are, and it may seem like, these are nameless, faceless people because they're famous. They are real human beings that are impacted by this stuff, and in this case, it was two guys who were just trying to make ends meet that were offered money and took it, and then their moral compass started kicking in, and they felt bad about it, so they tried to write it. They wanted to sing and have their actual voices on the next album. So anyway, This was a tragic story and orchestrates some of the challenges I've been mentioning. Morgan Wallen. He's been a scandal machine, and he's doing it at a time when he is literally the most popular artist in country music, although Luke Combs is a close second and Post Malone is coming on strong. But the one that got Morgan's tunes pulled for a while from some country stations, but certainly not all, was when he used a racial slur, the really bad one that we all know by just one letter. It's so bad. However, we watch all the data behind the scenes, not just country airplay, but all the data, and it was clear he did not lose the country audience when this story broke. He wasn't allowed to go on SNL that week. Some of his representation dropped him, and some country stations pulled his tunes, but country listeners stayed with him, at least from the data that we saw. It didn't affect it at all. Most of the comments I heard from country listeners and Morgan Wallen fans at the time was he was drunk, he didn't know he was being recorded. Obviously, he should never use that word. It should never be in a part of his vocabulary at all. But I'm not going to stop listening to his music because he said something stupid when he was partying with friends. That's the gist of most of what we saw. Then he threw a chair off a rooftop bar in Nashville and almost hit a cop. Had he hit the cop, it's likely listeners would have been opinions would have been changed. But to most of his very large fan base, this just seemed like a guy who needs to learn to handle his booze a little better, at least according to the comments that I've seen from country fans. Because the fans haven't turned on him, I've advised my country clients to continue playing Morgan Wallen's music. But if he doesn't change his behavior, I could absolutely see him getting a third strike, and that could change everything. The Dixie Chicks, now known as the Chicks. I was an on-air personality when this happened. For those of you that don't remember, on March 10th of 2003, Natalie Maines, the lead singer of the Dixie Chicks, went on stage at a concert in London and made negative comments about then-President George W. Bush. At that time, and it likely hasn't changed that much, over 90% of country listeners were Republicans. So this story did change country listeners' opinions, especially a little later after Toby Keith performed in front of a backdrop that featured a gigantic image of Natalie Maines beside Saddam Hussein. I was live on the air when this initially broke, and I immediately started getting tons of calls every time one of their songs played. And since the general public doesn't know that DJs don't personally choose the music, they were pretty brutal calls to take, to be honest with you. So I called my program director and said, should I replace these songs in the log or keep playing them? he emphatically said to continue playing them. By the way, a little background. At this time, I had been full-time at this station for 3 months. But prior to that, I'd been a small market program director, and I, of course, was raised in radio. So I knew the protocol well of what to do in a situation like this, and I knew to go to your direct report first, and that was the program director. But after I get off the phone with him, within minutes, I got a call on the hotline from one of the owners of the company, and he said, stop playing the Dixie Chicks immediately. I said, I just spoke to the PD, and he wants me to play them. The owner said, the PD doesn't own the radio station. We do. Stop playing them. I said, okay, but I need to call the PD and let them know. They said, fine, just don't play them in the interim, which wasn't a problem anyway, because it'd be an hour before they came up on the log again, and the PD, I knew he always answered when the studio called. But this really stuck for me on a personal level, to be selfish about it, because I really liked the Dixie Chicks music. I grew up and went to high school in Kerrville, Texas, about 20, 30 minutes away from Bandera, where Bruce Robinson and Charlie Robinson were raised. And Bruce, who I'm a super fan of, wrote Traveling Soldier, and that was number 2 on the charts, Dixie Chicks song at the time. And one of the Dixie Chicks, Emily, was married to Charlie Robinson. I knew both of them. I knew their dad, and I really liked them. Plus, I really loved the Dixie Chicks music. So not to be selfish about it, but it did personally bother me that we had to drop their music. I also could care less how they felt politically. How a musician votes will never impact whether or not I listen to their music. But I also felt like I was in a no-win position as the guy on air, because the listeners were already mad at me, of course, and I was about to either piss off the people who paid my check or the PD who hired me. Either one of those could have negative consequences for my paycheck and my well-being. A PD who, by the way, told me to keep playing them despite what the owners said, which I had to what I refused to do at the time, and that was the call I made. I told him to take it up with ownership, and you guys sort it out, but it certainly caused a rift between him and I. I doubt it had anything to do with it, with this particular situation, because there were a handful of other things that happened that put him in ownership's crosshairs. But 6 months later, he was out, and they made me the program director. Over the years, I've done multiple polls of country listeners. It started with 95% of them saying not to play the Dixie Chicks. Then it dipped to 93, then 90, then 80. Now I've got some stations I consult and work with that play them, and others that still don't play them. But listener polls still say don't play them if you do it today on country. However, it's a narrow margin. And I'm told every once in a while people call and say, why aren't you playing them? Or why aren't you playing them? Or why are you playing them? Why aren't you playing them? But for the most part, the calls have died down. The challenge with all of this is, where do you draw the line? At the height of the Me Too movement, I remember saying, man, if this ever crosses over into music, it's going to open up a lot of conversations and tough decisions for radio. Because if we judge musicians of the past by today's standards, then there are going to be a whole lot of bands and artists radio stations can't play anymore. Neither of them get much airplay anymore, but on terrestrial radio at least. But Elvis started dating Priscilla when she was 14. Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin. And there were infamous groupies that were 13 to 16-year-olds years old that very famous bands were known to get way too friendly with. And that went deep into the 70s and probably the early 80s, well after society had drawn lines that forbid that virtually everywhere. Is it wrong that many of us look the other way just because we like their music? Yeah, it probably is, but we do. It's all about where we individually draw the line. So where do you draw the line? Or, like me, do you agree that letting your audience make the decision, as long as it's a large enough sample base, sample size to give you an accurate measurement, is the right answer in most cases? Email me your thoughts, or better yet, record them, audio or video, and send them to me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com, and we'll try to include them in an upcoming episode. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Radio Influencers. Radio Influencers is a radio update production. New episodes are released on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern.